people that were included in the neuroimaging studies only focused on people that had a hyperarousal response response to listening to their own trauma. And so we scanned this first individual in our scanning study. We got her to recall the trauma, and we saw that while she was in the scanner recalling her trauma, her heart rate actually went down and her oxygen saturation came down. And so, immediately it was clear to me that she was shutting down, right? But back then, it may have been questioned whether she actually had PTSD. But because I was working with her clinically, I knew she had PTSD, right? And so I interviewed her after the scanner to get her subjective experience. And she clearly told me, I could feel nothing below my head. I was completely shut down. It was too overwhelming to recall the trauma, so I had to disconnect. And so I thought, wow, this is very different from, recalling the memory, having a hyperarousal response, an increase in heart rate. So immediately, right from the first subject, I realized that we had to look at the heterogeneity of response and divide this group into different responses.
The Neurofeed podcast, how are lives being transformed at the intersection of therapy, neuroscience, and technology. Our guest today is Dr. Ruth Lanius, MD. Ruth is Professor of Psychiatry and Director of the Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Research Unit at the University of Western Ontario. Currently holding the Harris Woodman Chair in Mind-Body Medicine at the Schulich School of Medicine and Dentistry at the University of Western Ontario, her research studies the neurobiology of trauma as well as treatment outcomes of pharmacological and psychotherapeutic methods. Thank you for joining us today, Ruth. I'm so excited about this conversation.
Yeah, it's such a pleasure to see you again, Lars. I always love our conversations.
Thank you. So maybe we could start with why did you start working, in this area where, the sort of boundary, the complicated boundary between neuroscience and trauma?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I really became interested in trauma during my internship. I had actually signed up to do neuropathology, and part of neuropathology was doing a general internship, and my first month was psychiatry. And I worked on a little inpatient unit, about 16 patients, and I loved working there. And as it turned out, most of those individuals were actually traumatized persons with trauma-related disorders, even though they weren't labeled as that at the time. And so I loved my work there, and I thought, I'm in the wrong field. I got to switch to psychiatry. And it was so fascinating for me to see how resilient the patients were. And I became really curious, how the brain could adapt to the experience they had gone through and really help them to survive. And so, yeah, that's how I really began in the field.
Interesting. And when you first started out, did you already have an instinct or a hunch that there were, because I guess for the field, from the behaviorists and the sort of this idea that that trauma, for example, affects the mind. There was not this idea that there's a neurophysiological component, right? That there's actually rooted in the actual physical structures in the brain. Did you begin with that sort of hunch or idea, or is that something that you discovered?
No, I was right at the beginning of that movement in the late 90s, and the papers were just coming out. And I was working in London, Ontario, which really has a world-class imaging center. And I had a neuroscience background. And so immediately, even during my training, I had a wonderful mentor who allowed me to pursue that interest in neuroimaging and really studying what happens in the brains of traumatized people.
one of the things that's interesting sort of about the way that you have done this is in ways that, for a long time, there's been this division between the neuroscience and the research that's being done and sort of the clinical application of it and how therapists are actually doing this work. And that's not something that's true for the way that you have approached this. It's very much from a like, what actually helps people, what works, and so on. So, was there a moment when you decided this is about, I want to use neuroscience to do this work, or were there a lot of other people doing research and clinicians that were kind of straddling that?
No, there were a few people at this time. And, when I worked on that inpatient unit that I mentioned earlier, and combined with my interest of neuroscience and this wonderful imaging lab in London, Ontario, that I had access to as a result of my mentor, it was sort of the perfect environment to bring all this together. And it was very clear for me right from the beginning that you need to start with the first person experience of the individual, and that this needs to really inform how you interpret all your results. And I'll give you an example. The first person I ever imaged, was a person who had, severe PTSD. I knew that as a clinician. And at the time, also, people that were included in the neuroimaging studies only focused on people that had a hyperarousal response in, response to listening to their own trauma. And so we scanned this first individual in our scanning study. We got her to recall the trauma, and we saw that while she was in the scanner recalling her trauma, her heart rate actually went down, and her oxygen saturation came down. And so, immediately it was clear to me that she was shutting down, right? But back then, it may have been questioned whether she actually had PTSD. But because I was working with her clinically, I knew she had PTSD, right? And so I interviewed her after the scanner to get her subjective experience. And she clearly told me, I could feel nothing below my head. I was completely shut down. It was too overwhelming to recall the trauma, so I had to disconnect. And so I thought, wow, this is very different from, recalling the memory, having a hyperarousal response, an increase in heart rate. So immediately, right from the first subject, I realized that we had to look at the heterogeneity of response and divide this group into different responses. And that only came because I was intimately familiar with her difficulties, right? And I interviewed her, and her subjective experience really informed how we set up this study. And so I think we really need to think more and more about bringing the clinical and the research piece together, because both are absolutely critical and really need to go hand in hand.
I find that really interesting because it seems like now the science shows the difference, for example, between tonic immobility that what you're just referring to as a shutdown, and the hyperarousal kind of response and stuff. Those are two different reactions to extreme situations. But people have seen that for years and years and just not known what they were looking at. And so what it raises for me is that how did you get to a place where it's almost like the folks who work in the mental health field sometimes have made assumptions about what is actually happening, maybe even judgments about the people who are presenting to them. How did you get to a stage where you're, for lack of a better way of framing it, you just believe people when they tell you this is extreme to me? Like, what, as a professional, like, that's not, you know what I mean? It seems like there's a lot of sort of influence in the field among, say, psychiatrists or clinicians in general that might recommend, oh, don't listen to the person because they don't know what their own experience is. But you're coming from this very much a perspective of like, okay, so let's start from they are actually explaining what's happening with them, and I'm going to believe them, and then look to see how to understand that. Am I getting that?
Yeah, absolutely. And my patients have always been my best teachers. And also one of my mentors, Bessel van der Kolk, I think said something very wise to me early on. And he said, the first year of any training should not involve the use of textbooks. It should just involve talking to the patients. And I think there's a real truth to that because, they are the experts. They know what they're going through. And, it's critical to listen so carefully, right? And really learn from them.
So one of the things that that you talk about a few years ago, Sebren shared this slide that really talks about how for folks who have an experience of severe trauma, CPTSD, however you want to describe it, that default mode network, the state that they're in just every day, that they feel comfortable in, that gets activated under threat. I wonder if you could talk about how that how y'all got to getting that, because I understand that there's still research that you're doing around the default mode network and how that relates to trauma for folks.
Oh, absolutely. It's a keen area of interest for us. Yeah, and so the default mode network is really a network that I think is a good model for the sense of self, which of course is so at the core of trauma, right? And the default mode network is really active when we're not engaged in, doing a task, for example, thinking or trying to problem solve or plan for the future. Or sort of an external task, and it's really active when we're involved in sort of internal reflection, right? So self-reflection, it's also involved in recalling memories, right? So if we go back inside and we remember something, and it's critical for connection with others. And so given these functions, it's really been used as a model for who we are in the world, how we see ourselves in the world, or a model of the sense of self, of who we are. And of course, that's at the core of trauma. And when we look at the default mode network under conditions of rest, right? So when we're not triggered, and of course, a traumatized brain is never at rest, but as much as at rest as it can be, this default mode network is very, very disconnected in individuals with post-traumatic stress. And just briefly, it has a back part and a front part. And the back part is largely involved with reliving memories, and the front part gives context to those memories. So you need the front part to help you to know that you're in the present and that what you're remembering has happened in the past. If you don't have the context, if you only have the back part of the network, it's like you're reliving the past over and over again, like the past is ever present. And so under conditions of rest in traumatized people, we see predominantly the back part of this default mode network active, and it lacks the connection to the context. It lacks the connection to the present. But what happens is when people are triggered by the trauma, those connections form to a certain extent. So it's almost like the sense of self or a semblance of the sense of self only comes online when conditions of threat are there. And of course, that has, I think, huge implications we need to think about, right? If I only have a semblance of feeling alive or a sense of who I am under threat, what activities may I engage in order to get to that place? And I think that's why people engage in substance use in certain areas, in prostitution. I think that's what may keep somebody in an abusive relationship with a perpetrator. And so I think there's profound implications that we need to think about that have come out of these results. And again, here, somebody who survived trauma really helped us to interpret these results. We sat with that person and we discussed the data, and we started making more and more sense out of these data. And we also have some beautiful quotes by individuals that really helped us to understand what was going on.
Makes sense. And a big piece of this that really inspires me about this work is that it's not simply about identifying what is happening in the brain. It's also about the sort of neuroplasticity, which, you know, I think that probably became really prevalent more in the last 20 years, this idea that it's actually possible to change the physical structures of our brain. And that's certainly not something that I grew up with. This idea, like, well, you know, if you have got a mental illness, you're broken. You're going to be like that for the rest of your days. And this is so exciting, this idea that you actually, no, we are changing our minds. This conversation is changing our minds as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's what brings us hope, right, to the trauma field, that we know the brain can change, and we see this clinically all the time, right? And now we're seeing it in terms of neuroimaging as well, right? That we can change both the structure and the function of the brain, right? And so, of course, traumatized brains had to adapt to inescapable threat, and now we have to help them to adapt to safety.
So I guess I'm thinking about the two sort of areas that you've been doing some research in. Like, there's still alpha down protocols. When I did my Google search about like all the research that you did last year, there's both the neurofeedback stuff and the deep brain reorienting. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how you know, how you came to do both of those things at the same time. Like, how does this all fit into I mean, it's just a lot of work that you're doing, Ruth, and I wonder how do you hold it all, you know, as a thing? How do you think about it all in terms of the research that you're doing? Or do you even, maybe you're just like, okay, well, this is what I'm doing.
No, we very much think about it. And I think as we're doing more and more research, we understand how the deep sections of the brain, especially the survival brain, or the reptilian brain, as some people call it, you know, very deep in the brain, are critical for reacting without thinking. And that's what really takes over in the aftermath of trauma, right? That's what helps you to survive these quick reactions without thinking. That's what helps you to survive. And often the thinking part of our brain, the cortex, is not fully online, right? And so the survival brain really takes over the main function of the brain, and then, you know, has a huge effect on the rest of the sections of the brain as well as the body. And so the whole question is, how can we intervene at this lower part of the brain to then, you know, really optimize the functioning of higher levels of the brain and the body, which then helps us to engage in therapy with language, making meaning, and things like that. And so this is why we've been pursuing different treatment types, for example, neurofeedback, and we've shown that neurofeedback can really have a direct effect on these deep levels of the brain, in the survival brain, and calm that, so we react less without thinking, and we calm that brain, which also informs how we view ourselves and how we view ourselves in the world, right? That foundation, right? We need to calm that foundation, which has an effect on everything else. So that's where we started with neurofeedback, and we were very excited that actually neurofeedback can get to this type of level, and then also have an effect on higher levels and really change some of the major brain networks that have been affected by trauma. Networks such as the default mode network and the salience network that help us to figure out what's most important in life so we can gauge our behavior and what we do. And this is also where deep brain reorienting came in, again, intervening deep, you know, getting to the root. And this is really, I think, where we became interested in deep brain reorienting, because as Frank Corrigan has suggested with beautiful neurobiological theory, that, you know, the first response to trauma is always an orienting response. You either orient to or away from the trauma. That's the foundation. And then the next reaction after the orienting response can be this shock response, and it's not until then that we have this visceral emotional response. And so I thought it was very beautiful how Frank postulated that DBR may be a successful treatment based on the deep neurobiology of the survival brain that's critical in the orienting response, shock response, and then the visceral emotions. And it's a sequenced approach that really follows, the foundations and the root of the trauma response. So really, again, getting to the foundation of the house, and by really firming up the foundation, you stabilize the whole house, the whole person.
That's awesome as a description for it. I wonder, can you describe a little bit what, so in the, I guess what I'm wondering about is the study, you all did a study with deep brain reorienting through an interface, through the virtual interface, and looking at the research paper, it was successful in terms of showing that that doing the DBR process helped people to recover somewhat from traumatic experiences. I wonder if you could describe that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're still very much involved in this study. The paper that we published are interim findings. And, you know, we started the study at the beginning of the pandemic, right? And so we had to go virtual.
Mm.
It was either not do it at all or do it virtually. Well, we thought, let's do it virtually. And it's, you know, we've seen incredibly moving results from people who are very, very sick. And it's been a really exciting study. And I think it's a study that really got our team through the pandemic. And, you know, we're still recruiting patients, and we're really focusing on the neuroimaging component that we couldn't do during large parts of the pandemic. So that's a real focus. And the original results are very, very promising.
That's awesome. And I'm thinking about this conversation that you're going to have with Frank and Seaburn in October. In this, you and I will join online to a hybrid conference in Johannesburg. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what is a conversation between the three of you? What does it suggest to you? What are the things that people are really gonna, what can we learn from the work that the three of you have been engaged in?
I think it'll be really interesting to see how the conversation emerges, right? I think, you know, we all have a lot of experience with DBR. We're passionate about the neurobiology, neuroplasticity, how we can change the brain. So I really look forward to our conversation.
That's great. And can you talk a little bit about what happens is there a place for neurofeedback and DBR to work together? And what are the things that you can do with the two of them combined that cannot be really addressed by each one separately?
I'm not sure I can answer your whole question, but all I can say, Lars, is that what I found while doing DBR is that my patients actually come in and demand neurofeedback. And that was something very interesting. I've always incorporated neurofeedback into my practice, but to actually come in and demand it, I thought was very interesting. And I think there's just an awareness, and I think a seeking of more awareness that the neurofeedback can often help with. And so, that's been a really interesting and exciting observation for me. So I think in the future, there'll be a lot of opportunity to explore, the use of both. at the same time, or not at the same time, but in the same
Yeah,
therapy. Yeah.
that's great. So it's, um, I'm not saying anything really shocking by saying that we live in traumatizing times, between the the climate instability, the rise of sort of authoritarian regimes, the multiple genocides that are happening around the world. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what, um, is there, I guess part of where this is coming from is like there has been this sense of like there is kind of a default way that things work in the world, that the world functions mostly okay, and we approach individuals who have some dysfunction or whatever. And I wonder, if you could speculate a little bit about sort of what what is the role for clinicians in a world where there is so much dislocation that's going on there? Like what kinds of things, like what advice could you give to clinicians who are really trying to figure out how do we approach the whole idea of mental health in a time when the suicide rates are skyrocketing? This kind of disruption and dysfunction is just increasing.
And people are so much more acutely ill too, right?
Yeah.
And I think what's going on in the world affects us all, right? And I think what we need is hope, and we need more and more skills to deal with the increased acuity, right? But we all need hope, right? And I think neuroplasticity is one thing that gives us hope, especially as mental health clinicians, right? And when we're working with such a sick population, we need more and more skills, right? So we don't feel that level of helplessness and, feeling de-skilled. That is easy to feel with trauma, right? And so I think the more we can learn about adjunct treatments, the more we can learn how the brain can change after treatment, I think that will bring hope, not just to us as therapists, but also to every single one of our clients.
That's great. And in your profession and in the work that you've done, you've really just jumped in with both feet into areas where there wasn't a lot of previous research or understanding. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what, how have you done that? How do you have the confidence to go in and go, I don't know what is actually happening here neuroscientifically or neurophysiologically, but we're going to explore this thing. What is that? What's the narrative that you're telling yourself as you go into this thing? How to have confidence in there are answers.
Yeah, people always told me when I first started, you're not going to have a career studying dissociation. And, that didn't matter to me. It wasn't about a career. It was about being curious and studying the things that I felt needed to be studied and the things that I felt were overlooked by the system. And so I just went with that. And I'm really glad I did. Because, I wanted to pursue what I felt was necessary to pursue, not what would get me the next grant more easily.
And when you think about, say, 10 years from now or 20 years from now,
Yeah.
what do you think, what do you see? Where like, could you speculate a little bit about what we're looking towards with respect to the therapeutic process or trauma recovery, those kinds of things?
It's a great question, Lars, and not an easy one to answer. But I think what we're learning, especially from the DBR data pre-post, and we're using a very high magnetic field strength, 7 Tesla. So that gives us a much greater understanding of the deeper parts of the brain and how they interact with the higher parts of the brain. It's going to revolutionize our understanding of the effects of trauma on the brain. And I think we will then be able to use this to really develop future therapies and also, really help us to see what problem in the brain predicts outcome, what's associated with, better outcome, what's associated with poorer outcome, and how can we target those difficulties directly. And I think artificial intelligence will be able to help in the future as well. And what we want to find is really a treatment that I think fundamentally readapts the brain to safety. And I think we will. And I think we're on the way there.
That's great. Thank you. And one of the studies that I found when I was doing my search was about moral injury. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what that means, how do people recover? How do they experience that? How do they feel that? And how do you overcome it?
Another really easy question, Lars.
I'm asking all the easy ones.
Yeah, so I think, how do we describe what happens in moral injury? And I always quote the Vietnam veteran that I spoke to years ago. And he said, "I cannot look anyone in the eye for fear that they will see the stain on my soul." And I think that summarizes moral injury, right? So feeling that what you've done is horrible and that you're a dreadful person and you're not deserving of anything positive. You don't deserve to connect with others. You're a horrible person, right? And that's a very visceral experience. So yes, there's interpretations. I am bad. I don't deserve anything good. But that's also very visceral, right? You feel torn apart inside. And again, I think we need to think about how do we calm those deep visceral sensations in order to free the sense of self, to feel, what I did may have been horrible, but at the time, I had no choice. So to calm that viscera, to free how we view ourselves and the world. Does that make any sense?
It does. Well, thank you for taking the time today to talk about all the work that you've been doing. And I wonder if is there anything that you would like to share with folks? The conference is happening in October.
No, just that I'm very excited about the conference, and I'd like to thank everyone for the really important work that they do in a very difficult time.
Thanks for watching. If you found something helpful, use a like and subscribe. It helps us with YouTube algorithm and lets us know we're on the right track.